Welcome in, everybody. Ready to take a trip back in time with us? Today, we're diving deep into Victorian Leeds, and wow, we've got a ton of sources here, articles, historical accounts, really the whole works. And it's fascinating because they paint like these two totally different pictures of the city.
Right, you see it called the capital of the North, this bustling hub of industry and opportunity. But then other accounts label it a wilderness of foulness,
Yeah.
a place just riddled with poverty and disease.
Yeah, it's wild. So which was it really? A beacon of progress or a den of despair? I guess that's what we're here to figure out.
Well, I think it's that very contrast that makes Victorian Leeds so compelling. It's like a snapshot of the entire era, the good, the bad, all tangled up together. And to really understand it, we have to go back to the source, the driving force, the Industrial Revolution that was coursing through the city's veins.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock. The Victorian era, we're talking 1837 to 1901, a time of monumental change, and Leeds was right in the thick of it, becoming England's fourth largest city, a global powerhouse for textile production. But you know what really jumps out from these sources? It's the sheer speed of it all. It wasn't this slow and steady evolution, it was like an explosion of growth.
And you know what was fueling that explosion? Quite literally, the river Aire. It wasn't just about moving goods, though. We are talking massive quantities of everything from raw wool to finished cloth being shipped all over the world. The Aire was the lifeblood of those mills and factories, the giants of industry. Picture it, those early water wheels, then the steam engines all clanging and hissing, all thanks to that river.
So we've got this image of a booming city driven by innovation and this constant churn of industry. But then the sources pull back the curtain and we see the harsh reality for a huge chunk of the population. This wasn't prosperity for everyone.
No, not at all. The wealth generated by the Industrial Revolution, it created this city of extremes. On one hand, you had merchants, factory owners living in the lap of luxury, enjoying long and comfortable lives. And then on the flip side, you had the working class trapped in poverty, their lives often cut tragically short. The sources actually cite a shocking difference in life expectancy, an average of 44 years for the wealthy compared to just 19 years for the poorest in Leeds.
19 years. That's almost unimaginable. What factors contributed to such a drastic disparity?
It was this perfect storm of hardship. Think about those cramped, unsanitary conditions in the back-to-back houses, rows upon rows of dwellings sharing walls with multiple families often crammed into a single room. These weren't just homes, they were breeding grounds for disease.
Hold on, back-to-back houses. I'm picturing something pretty bleak, but can you paint a clearer picture of what those are actually like?
Imagine row after row of these narrow houses built in long lines, only a front and back door, no side windows, very little ventilation, and often multiple families sharing what little space there was. And when I say little, I mean 1 or 2 rooms for an entire family to live in.
Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and then you add to that the lack of basic amenities. The sources mention things like middensteads and overflowing privies. Honestly, some of these descriptions are pretty hard to stomach.
It was a public health nightmare. Middensteads were basically open pits filled with human waste and trash just left to rot in courtyards or even the streets. Couple that with the lack of clean water and overflowing privies, those shared outhouse toilets, and you've got the perfect recipe for the spread of deadly diseases like cholera. Hundreds died in outbreaks that just ravaged these poor communities. So yeah, we've been talking about these really grim conditions, and you have to wonder, how did people even begin to deal with this? I mean, did the city just ignore it, or...
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the cholera outbreaks earlier. I can't even imagine the fear and the desperation during those times. Did they even do anything to address these public health crises?
Well, there was definitely a shift happening. The sources describe this growing awareness that something had to change. And it wasn't just about cleaning up the streets, though removing those middensteads and putting in sewers. That was a massive step. It was a change in thinking, a realization that public health was directly tied to the environment people lived in.
So they were starting to understand the connection between clean water and disease prevention. That seems so obvious now, but back then it must have been revolutionary.
It absolutely was. And it really led to the birth of what we now think of as public health, as its own field.
Yeah.
Think about it, campaigns encouraging hand washing, educating people about proper food, handling the first attempts to track and prevent outbreaks. All of that has roots in the Victorian era.
It's incredible how those early efforts born out of such desperate circumstances really paved the way for the public health systems we rely on today. But even with all these challenges, there's this other side to Victorian Leeds that really stands out in the sources, this cultural vibrancy. Despite the poverty, the disease, the grime people still found ways to create beauty and joy in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the hardships, but the people of Victorian Leeds, they craved entertainment and connection just like we do today. The sources really bring those music halls to life. They weren't just performances, they were spectacles.
Okay, so I'm picturing these lavish music halls filled with laughter and song. Were there any particular acts or performers that drew huge crowds back then? Like anyone we might recognize as a Victorian era celebrity?
Well, music hall culture was all about variety. You'd have singers belting out popular tunes, comedians telling jokes that probably wouldn't fly today, and dancers just captivating audiences with their skill. Some names, though, like Marie Lloyd, she became synonymous with the music hall scene, achieving a level of fame that rivals our modern-day celebrities.
And the audience, what was that like? I'm imagining this mix of people all packed into these theaters, just eager for a night of entertainment.
You're right on the mark. Those music halls were incredibly diverse spaces. You might have wealthy merchants rubbing shoulders with factory workers, all caught up in the shared experience of a good laugh or a catchy tune. It's a reminder that even in a city as divided as Victorian Leeds, those moments of shared joy could really transcend social boundaries.
And it wasn't just music halls, right? The sources mentioned theaters and sporting events, too. Did those offer a similar kind of escape from the daily grind?
Oh, definitely. Theaters gave people the chance to be transported to different worlds, to experience these stories of love, loss, adventure. And then you've got the rise of spectator sports like cricket and football. Picture the excitement of watching your team compete, the camaraderie of cheering alongside your neighbors.
Sounds like even back then, people understood the importance of blowing off steam, finding those moments of escape and shared experience. But what about those who couldn't afford a night out at the music hall or a ticket to the cricket match? Were there other ways for people to connect and socialize?
Leeds had this whole network of clubs and societies for pretty much any interest you could imagine. Whether you were into debating, singing, even pigeon fancying, there was a group for you.
Pigeon fancying. Now, that's not something I expected to hear, but it really highlights the incredible diversity of interests and passions within the city. Did these clubs and societies play a role in bridging the social divide at all, or were they mostly divided along class lines?
That's a really interesting question, and it's one that historians are still debating. While some clubs were definitely exclusive, others were more open and inclusive. The sources suggest that these groups, no matter their specific focus, they served a really important social function. They created this sense of belonging and shared identity.
So, in a way, these clubs and societies were like little microcosms of the larger city, reflecting both its divisions and its potential for unity. It's a reminder that even in a society marked by inequality, there were still these spaces for people to connect and find common ground.
Exactly. And speaking of finding common ground, we can't forget the role of religion in Victorian Leeds. The sources emphasize how influential various denominations were in shaping the city's social fabric.
That's right. We haven't touched on religion yet. I'm curious about the religious landscape of Victorian Leeds. Was there one dominant faith, or was it a more diverse mix?
Leeds was a real mix of religious beliefs, mirroring the trends in Victorian England as a whole. The Church of England definitely held a prominent position, but there were also sizable Methodist, Baptist, Congregationalist, and Catholic communities, all adding to the city's unique character.
With that mix of faiths, did religious groups play a role in tackling the social issues we've been discussing? Things like poverty, child labor, the lack of sanitation. Were these concerns addressed by religious leaders and institutions?
Oh, absolutely. The sources describe this kind of complex relationship between religion and social reform. Some religious leaders were right at the forefront of the movement to improve living conditions, fighting for workers' rights, and helping the poor. Others, though, focus more on spiritual matters, emphasizing personal morality and salvation.
So it sounds like religion in Victorian Leeds wasn't this single force, but rather a complex tapestry of different beliefs and approaches to social problems. Did these varying viewpoints ever lead to conflict or tension within the city?
There were definitely times of disagreement and debate, especially between different denominations or between those pushing for social change and those who wanted to stick with tradition. But there were also examples of cooperation and working together, particularly when it came to providing charity or promoting education.
It seems like, much like the clubs and societies we talked about earlier, religion in Victorian Leeds reflected both the divisions and the potential for coming together within the city. It's a reminder that even within a shared faith, there were lots of different perspectives on how to best address the challenges of the time. We've covered so much ground in our deep dive into Victorian Leeds, the industry, the hardships, the cultural scene, even the role of religion. It's clear this city was like a mini version of the Victorian era itself, dealing with huge change and contradictions. But as we wrap up, I keep coming back to this question: what traces of that era are still visible in Leeds today?
One thing that's impossible to miss is the city's industrial DNA. Those grand Victorian buildings, the town hall, the corn exchange, they weren't just symbols of wealth. They were making a statement. And even though many of those back-to-back houses are gone, you can still find pockets of them, reminders of a past the city is both coming to terms with and preserving.
It's like layers of history all built on top of each other. So we've got the architecture, but what about the industries themselves? Obviously, textiles aren't the driving force they once were.
True, but Leeds hasn't just stayed frozen in time. It's reinvented itself, becoming a center for finance, technology, media. That entrepreneurial spirit, that willingness to adapt and innovate, it's a thread that runs from the Victorian era to today.
But would you say that some of that economic shift came with a cost? I mean, the decline of traditional industries like textiles must have had a big impact on the city and its people.
You're absolutely right. There were definitely growing pains, job losses, and entire communities struggling with the changes.
Mm.
And even as new industries came in, the issue of inequality, of making sure everyone has opportunities, that's a struggle that continues to this day.
It sounds like an echo of those stark social divisions we talked about earlier, just playing out in new ways. But what really stood out to me in these sources is that even with all the hardships, there was this push for social reform in Victorian Leeds. That desire for a fairer, healthier society, did that have a lasting impact?
Definitely. The Victorians might not have gotten everything right, but they were pioneers in many ways. Think about the public health movement, those early efforts to improve sanitation, understand the connection between living conditions and disease that really laid the foundation for the health systems we rely on today.
And it wasn't just public health. The sources highlight the fight for workers' rights, the emergence of social welfare organizations, this growing awareness of the need to tackle poverty and inequality. Do you see a link between those Victorian-era movements and the social activism we see in Leeds today?
Absolutely. There's a clear connection from those Victorian reformers to the activist organizations working to address the challenges we face now. Whether it's advocating for affordable housing, promoting sustainable development, or fighting for social justice, that spirit of social conscience, that belief in collective action, is woven into the fabric of Leeds.
It's almost like a ripple effect, the actions of one generation influencing the next. So as we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, what can we, the citizens of the 21st century, learn from Victorian Leeds? What wisdom can we take from their successes and their failures?
I think the biggest takeaway is the interconnectedness of it all. The choices we make today about environmental sustainability, economic opportunity, social justice, they're all shaping the Leeds of tomorrow.
Hmm.
The Victorians, through their triumphs and their mistakes, they showed us that progress isn't automatic. It's something we have to constantly fight for.
That's a powerful thought. We're not just living in the present, we're building the future. And just like the people of Victorian Leeds, we have a responsibility to create a city that's both prosperous and fair, a place where opportunities thrive, but where history guides our decisions.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's fitting to leave our listener with a question, to think about what kind of legacy do you want to leave for future generations in Leeds? What will you do to make sure this city keeps thriving, learning from its past, and embracing the possibilities of the future?
That's definitely something to reflect on. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey through Victorian Leeds. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating exploration of history and what it means for us today. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep uncovering those hidden stories that connect us all.